Mr Acting Deputy President, I rise today to oppose the government's legislation to deregulate higher education. Mr Acting Deputy President, a great public purpose requires adequate public funding. That is the matter that we have at hand here today. And I reject the remarks from Senator Madigan that people don't have the courage of their convictions in here and that people aren't doing the right thing by the university sector. Let me tell you, Mr Acting Deputy President, the Greens have consistently opposed cuts to university funding and opposed cuts to research funding. We have done so always, and we have also put forward propositions to raise the revenue in order to fund public education, public universities and research and development, and have done so. As recently as a week ago, I put forward a proposal that we stop the flat rate of 15% tax on contributions to superannuation, and that we do it in a progressive way similar to income tax. That would raise $10 billion over the forward estimates. Now, the Vice-Chancellors a few years ago ran a very strong campaign trying to argue to the Australian community that we needed to raise more revenue to spend on universities, and I agree. The Greens were out there supporting the campaign to raise revenue to put more public money into universities. But I have to say to you that Senator Madigan was correct in saying that over the recent years, over the decades actually, the level of funding to universities has been cut back. And when the former Labor government, in their MyEFO statement in 2012-13, announced cuts to research, we objected to that. When Labor went into the 2013 election announcing its cut to university funding, they announced that in April 2013, we opposed it, and we went into the election opposing it, and we said that after the election there is no doubt that Labor in opposition would change its mind, and it has. And I'm very pleased about that, because the fundamental principle here is if you want to change from a dig-it-up, cut-it-down, ship-it-away economy to a 21st century economy where imagination is the key resource, not coal, not iron ore, not cutting down native forests, but actually investing in the brains base of this nation, then you have to fund public education and universities. Now, where the last government went wrong was the announcement that they would cut the funding to universities in order to spend it on the Gonski reforms. Well, I totally support the Gonski reforms. They should have gone ahead, and we should be funding that, but you don't take money out of universities to fund public schools. You need to fund schools, education at every level, from early childhood right through the education school system through to universities and TAFEs. That is the way of the future in Australia, and I'm one of those people who was at university before Gough Whitlam brought in free education in Australia. And I can tell you from a relatively poor farming family in the northwest of Tasmania, where my parents were dairy farmers, my mother was a teacher, but in order for me to get through school I got scholarships, and I had to get scholarships to get to university. And I had the choice between a Commonwealth scholarship and a teacher studentship, and I took the teacher studentship because it paid more than a Commonwealth scholarship at that time. I know what it's like to be fronting the fact that you may not be able to go to university because you can't afford it, and that is precisely the case for so many people, and that's why deregulation is so wrong. To say to young people, the Parliament of Australia refuses to raise the revenue to put into schools and into public education, and so the result is we're going to cut public funding to universities. We're going to tell the universities they have to raise fees in order to cover the gap. And raising those fees, of course, means hurting a lot of people and making people think twice about the course that they go into. They won't have the same choices that they otherwise would have. And the fact is that Australia spends proportionately less public money on universities than most OECD countries, yet very few argue for international standards of investment. and that was Professor Glyn Davies had that to say in a speech that he made on this very issue, saying that he was one of the people who supported more public funding to universities so you wouldn't be in this bind of raising fees to make up the difference. So the real issue here is how are we going to fund our universities? Do we agree, first and foremost, that education is the most important investment we can make in the country in order to not only survive in the face of global warming, but to reduce the gap, the inner gap between the rich and the poor, reduce that inequality in wealth that we have in this country? And I would argue it is the most important thing we can do, and that's why we should be raising the money from those who can afford to pay it to invest in 21st century national infrastructure, and by infrastructure I mean in brains, in the human capacity base of this country, and also, of course, in other infrastructure, but that is where we need to be fundamentally going. I am concerned that with this deregulation proposal, a teacher would graduate with a HECS debt around $90,000, and it would take them decades, up to 40 years and more, to pay it off. And of course women are going to be disadvantaged in this context because they're the ones who end up often taking time out in part-time work or no work, and so ultimately end up resuming full-time work once the children go to school, and then be spending years in order to pay this back. In terms of Tasmania, the Tasmanian University is in a unique position because we have one university for the whole state. That doesn't apply anywhere else. The Tasmanian University is the key to actually improving educational opportunity for all Tasmanians. The Tasmanian University has a campus in Launceston and opened a campus on the northwest coast. The northwest coast being the area of Tasmania where there is one of the poorest retention rates to senior secondary education, let alone university. And the provision of that northwest campus has enabled people who left school at an early age to go back and actually finish their education. It's been a great contribution to Tasmania. And yet, with the cuts that were being proposed, we could have seen the Tasmanian University lose out by $113 million. Not only that, but seeing many students not being given that opportunity to go on to further education. And since we have only one university, fee competition would not work in Tasmania. You'd be saying to students, well, you can go to the mainland to try and get cheaper fees, but the reality is you've got to pay to get there, you've got to pay the rents when you get there, you've got to pay the costs of accommodation and living expenses, and so it just wouldn't work out to be any cheaper. So the reality is you're condemning Tasmanians to no competition in the scheme of things and having to pay whatever the fees actually resulted in. We need to have a situation where we have got full-time, permanent teaching staff in universities and research staff. I don't want to go down the path of seeing some universities declared universities and have no research capacity. A public university has to have teaching and research. It has to have permanent staff. It has to have opportunities for young people to achieve to their highest potential and actually assist this country to get where it needs to be in a world moving rapidly to a low-carbon economy, and actually having to be part of developing the service sector and developing a global economy which is not based on the consumption of the natural resources of the planet. And this week we've had the International Energy Agency out saying for the first time that we've got global emissions flatlining from the energy sector. For the first time you have economic growth globally at 3%, no economic downturn and emissions flatlining. That demonstrates that decoupling global greenhouse gas emissions from growth is possible. But that means in Australia we have to have a rapid shift in the way that we live, in the way that we earn, in the way that society operates, and that means massive opportunity, but only if you invest in that opportunity. I just wanted to, and I'm aware of the time, and so I just wanted to make a remark about the cutback that was proposed, the blackmail effectively, in order for the government to try and get deregulation over the line. There was the proposal to cut research funding. That would have had a mega negative impact on the integrated marine observing system in Tasmania. That was going to run out of funding by June, and it is essential to a whole range of research, not only in Tasmania but right around the world. It would have been a disaster if the government had pursued that, and for Minister Pyne to try to blackmail the parliament, saying either you pass my deregulation.
Senator Milne, resume your seat, Chair, please. Senator O'Sullivan.
On 3 occasions.
A point of order.
Yes, I do. The reference suggesting that Minister Pyne has committed the act of blackmail has been raised here 3 times. 3 chairs have made the people withdraw it, and I ask that you ask the senator to withdraw the assertion. It is like being on day, Senator. I'm having a nightmare.
I'll ask you, Senator Milne, to reflect on what you've said, and if you think it's appropriate, you can withdraw it.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I will rephrase what I have said to say that Minister Pyne made it very clear that unless the Senate passed his deregulation, he would defund research institutions. I think it's pretty clear to the community what sort of standover tactic that was for the Senate, and people have rejected it absolutely correctly, but it demonstrates no real understanding of just how important research is to be funded and just how important universities are to be funded. And so I think we've got to the point in Australia, when this is where I do agree with Senator Madigan's remarks, this parliament has to decide whether it's prepared to raise the money to fund universities. I can understand why Vice-Chancellors are worried about this. How are they going to cope? How are they going to run a university, have permanent staff, have the variety of courses they want to offer, and be able to afford it with funding cutbacks? And that is why the Greens stand here to say we want more public funding for education from early childhood through schools right through universities and TAFE, and we are prepared to raise the money to pay for it by securing that money from those who can afford to pay. We could remove, for example, the fossil fuel subsidy to the big miners, $2 billion a year. $2 billion, just like that, if the government decided not to give Gina Rinehart and et al. That $2 billion, we've got it there to put into universities. We could do the progressive taxation on contributions to superannuation. We could restore the carbon price. What about that? $13 billion over the forward estimates to bring down pollution and drive the change we need in Australia and bring down emissions at the same time. There are so many ways of raising money. But yet this parliament sat here last sitting week and Labor and Liberal got together and gave $200 million to another fossil subsidy to the mining industry for small miners for exploration. $200 million just like that, yes, to the small mining industry. Just go off and do that. Remove the penalty for people who supposedly inadvertently breach the cap of superannuation contributions, and yet if they'd been at Centrelink they would be down into the criminal justice system as quick as you could say Jack Robinson. So I think there are many ways of raising money, but you've got to get serious about raising it from the big end of town, raising it from the tax avoiders, raising it from people who are taking their money offshore to tax havens, actually getting stuck into the trusts in Australia that hide the level of income they get. Let's actually fund our public universities. Wouldn't that be a great contribution to the future of this country? Let's actually make sure that those people who benefited from a free education are the people who deliver to the next generation of publicly funded education. Because I can tell you, whenever I go out, people say to me how annoyed they are that the very people who benefited from Gough Whitlam's free education are the very ones who have gone and cut back on that free education and have insisted on the cuts, and it's wrong. And that's why the Greens will be absolutely opposing this government's legislation.